Imagine an army that, in just 1 century, conquered almost half of the known world. In the 13th century, the Mongol hordes inspired terror, were considered an unstoppable force, and in the accounts of contemporaries and later chroniclers, their numbers often reached fantastic proportions. But how many Mongol warriors were there in reality, who marched from the steppes of Central Asia to the borders of Europe and the Middle East? In this video, we will try to figure out the real size of the Mongol armies by evaluating historical data and answer the question of whether the Mongol army was really as huge as it was believed to be. Just a reminder, you're watching Amazing History, the channel for those who truly love history. And we continue our series of episodes dedicated to the Mongols. You can support my humble work, as always, with a like, a subscription, and kind comments, as well as with a donation on Patreon or PayPal. Now let's get started with the topic of this episode. At the beginning of their history, Mongol armies were mainly made up of men from their own tribe. The most skilled warriors were selected for the Keshik, the personal guard serving powerful chiefs and military leaders. At the beginning of Temujin's reign, the number of these elite warriors was only a few hundred people. However, since the founding of the Mongol Empire, Temujin fundamentally changed the structure and nature of warfare on the steppe. The main transformation was the absorption of neighboring steppe tribes during the prolonged Unification wars. This process was completed at the Kurultai in 1206, where Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, the great Khan of the United Tribes. Under his rule were the Merkits, Karaitis, Naimans, Tatars, Uyghurs, Oirats, Buryats, and others. These once warring tribes were now recognized as a single people under the common name Mongols. By uniting various steppe peoples, Genghis Khan gained a significant pool of manpower, which was effective thanks to military reforms. Every able-bodied man between the ages of 15 and 60 was required to serve. Conscripts were required to bring at least one horse and a set of equipment with them. If a warrior lacked equipment, his immediate commander provided him with everything he needed. The armament of Mongol warriors could vary. However, historical sources, including Chinese texts and Persian chronicles, allow us to reconstruct the typical armament. Ideally, each steppe warrior had at least one suit of armor, 2 or more composite bows, and several hundred arrows. The arsenal could also include a long and a short spear, a mace or an axe, a knife, and a flint. The warrior also brought his personal banner. Horses were a key part of the equipment. Each rider had to have at least 3 horses, and on average, according to estimates, their number could reach 6. This allowed the Mongols to change horses on the march, maintain a high speed of movement, and use them as a source of food when necessary. When talking about the organization of the Mongol troops, it is also necessary to mention the category of non-nomadic or garrison troops. As a rule, they were not part of the main steppe army and were mainly used for garrison duty or to support siege operations. Such auxiliary units could be assembled from conquered peoples and were called cheriki, from the Mongolian word checherek, meaning a unit or army. Among the first such garrison troops were Jin soldiers who had deserted or been captured during the Mongol campaigns in northern China. These groups, having retained their officers and battle formations, came to be called Heichun, or the Black Army. Their task was to hold and defend the conquered territories. Later, during administrative reforms, significant units of the Black Army were reorganized following the model of the Mongolian military structure, which gave rise to the Shin-Chan, or New Army. All Mongolian army units got their structure and purpose from the Mongolian administration, which met at the Kurultai Assembly. The Kurultai was an assembly of tribes, chiefs, and military leaders, where khans were elected, commanders were appointed, and key strategic decisions about campaigns were made. These grand events were also accompanied by feasts, dances, and games, as was fitting for a large gathering of thousands of people. After the Kurultai, the army would set out for war. The army was organized according to the decimal system, where the smallest combat unit was the Arban, a squad of 10 men led by an Arban Noyan. The units usually consisted of mounted archers, who were sometimes supplemented by heavily armed cavalry used in close combat. The exact ratio varied, but according to historical data, it is believed that for every close combat warrior, there were several light archers. Therefore, to simplify our calculation, let's assume Arban's unit consisted of six archers and 4 heavy cavalrymen. It's worth making a clarification here. I'm using the term heavily armed cavalrymen purely as a convention. These warriors were much lighter and much more mobile than European knights. It would be more accurate to use the term medium-armed cavalrymen here. They could be equipped with long spears and shields. Their protection was provided by a metal helmet and armor made of metal plates connected by leather straps. Each warrior usually had about 6 riding horses with him on average, which amounted to a total of 60 horses per Arban, most of which were mares. It can be assumed that in addition to war horses, the troops were accompanied by flocks of sheep and pack animals, including camels, which played an important role in providing food and transporting equipment. The warriors could also have had dogs, such as banhars, known for their ability to herd animals and guard the camp. Warriors from the same Arban could live in one yurt, called a ger. It could be disassembled and transported on a cart hitched to one of the draft animals. Such a large number of animals accompanying the Mongol army played a major role in providing them with food in the field. The diet of the Mongol army was largely based on dairy products. Horses produced milk, from which the warriors made kumis, a refreshing and nutritious fermented dairy drink. Another common product was kurut, dried cottage cheese, which was easy to transport and could be diluted with water. The Mongols also fed on the blood of their horses in extreme cases and prepared dried meat. For campaigns such as the Khwarezm campaign, Arban relied on about 3 to 4 carcasses of dried sheep, which were boiled in a cauldron as kebabs. Thus the Mongol army continued to develop. But let's continue about the structure of the Mongol army. The next unit after the Arban was the Jagun, which consisted of 10 Arbans, that is, it included 100 warriors. This was approximately 60 mounted archers and 40 medium-armed cavalrymen for close combat. This unit was commanded by the Jagun Noyan. Based on our previous assumptions, the Jagun was accompanied by about 600 horses, around 30 sheep or other animals for food, about a dozen camels, several Bankar dogs for protection, and about 5 to 7 carts with belongings. In the camp, such a unit was accommodated in about 10 yurts. To feed all these animals, a plentiful supply of grass and water was necessary, which was vital for the successful advance of the army. Since the Mongol troops depended heavily on pastures, their movements were often limited by geography. If the pastures in a certain area ran out or the conditions became unsuitable, the army had to either move on or return to the steppe. In the battle system, the Jagun could also be used as the vanguard of a group of scouts called Aljinchi, or those who go ahead. The Aljinchi operated at a considerable distance, usually from 30 to 75 kilometers ahead of the main column, acting as scouts and raiders. They looked for supply sources, suppressed resistance along their path, and gathered information for the army. In peacetime, the Aljinchi served as garrisons, monitoring occupied territories and maintaining control over them, signaling the army if it was necessary to mobilize forces against a possible rebellion. The next level in the decimal system was a group of 10 Jaguns, known as a Myangan, which included 1,000 warriors. Accordingly, about 600 of them were light-mounted archers, and 400 were medium or heavy cavalry. This unit was commanded by the Myangan Nayon. Based on previous assumptions, each Myangan had a herd of about 6,000 riding horses, around 300 sheep, about 100 camels, several herding dogs, and up to 100 carts carrying equipment and food supplies. For camp accommodation, up to 100 yurts were required, plus an additional yurt for the commander and his retinue. The Myangan was considered the smallest autonomous operational unit, suitable for conducting independent military operations, and in peacetime for managing nomadic settlements, which consisted not only of warriors, but also their families and support personnel. In peacetime, the Myangans could be stationed in conquered territories and serve both for security and for collecting tribute. At the initial stage of conquest, they often performed this function, but over time, as the Mongol Empire developed, tribute began to be collected through state structures. When the call to war was sounded, the Myangan could easily mobilize and move into enemy territories, often being at the forefront of the main army. They supported the advanced reconnaissance units, Alginshi, and established supply bases for the forward forces. Such a mobile structure of the Myangan significantly increased the speed and effectiveness of the Mongol army, which earned them a reputation as one of the most maneuverable forces in military history. Then, 10 Myangans were combined into one Tumen, numbering 10,000 men, of which approximately 6,000 were horse archers and 4,000 were medium or heavy cavalry. The Tumen was accompanied by a herd of about 60,000 horses, 3,000 sheep, up to 1,000 camels and dogs, as well as about 1,000 wagons for transporting equipment and provisions. Since the Tumen was intended for major military operations, it could be accompanied by up to 500 engineers and craftsmen, specialists trained to build fortifications and camps, often recruited from conquered peoples such as the Jin dynasty or the Western Xia kingdom. It should be noted that each of the terms used to refer to Mongol units also referred to administrative territorial units. For example, an Arban was associated with 10 households, a Jagun with 100, a Myangan with 1,000, and the population of one Tumen was required to provide 10,000 warriors. The commander of a Tumen was considered a representative of a large nomadic community, so this position was extremely prestigious. The first commanders of Tumens under Chinggis Khan were his closest associates, such as Subedey, Jebe, Kubilai, and Jelme. These renowned commanders often led their Tumens at the forefront of Mongol conquest campaigns, effectively acting as independent operational groups, paving the way for the main army. Their autonomy and ability to operate without direct support from the main forces are impressive and demonstrate the scale of capabilities of such 10,000-strong units. Although the combat strength of a Tumen may seem relatively small on paper, it was accompanied by about 60,000 horses and thousands of additional animals and support personnel who were rarely taken into account when assessing the size of the army. All of this significantly increased the resource needs of the Tumens. To support such a unit, extensive pastures and water resources were needed, estimated at between 280 and 850 square kilometers of land. These figures clearly show why the Mongol Tumens, like locusts, consumed vast supplies along their way, and why their leaders had to carefully plan their movements to avoid depleting resources in too limited an area. But the true scale of the Mongol army becomes especially apparent when several Tumens are combined into a single force. For example, 3 Tumens already make up about 30,000 warriors, of which around 18,000 are horse archers and 12,000 are other warriors, medium and heavily armored cavalrymen. Such a unit was commanded by a Noyan appointed by the Khan, who had significant authority and the ability to assign command positions among subordinate vassals. To support such an army, up to 180,000 horses, about 9,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, and approximately 3,000 wagons were used, as well as a large number of yurts. In addition to the army, auxiliary personnel joined, including engineers. If we talk about the total number of the entire Mongol army during the reign of Chinggis Khan, it varies in historical sources. Numbers of 500,000 to 600,000 warriors are mentioned. But it's difficult to name an exact number due to the lack of reliable statistics and conflicting data. If we assume that the entire male population of the Mongols was in military service, and that's about 15 to 20% of the total nomadic population, which, according to various estimates, ranged from 700,000 to 1 million people. So, the most reasonable estimates bring us to a number of 100 to 130,000 warriors. Most likely, the Mongol army usually did not remain as a single unit, but was divided into separate parts to make logistics easier and to maneuver more easily around enemies. As they advanced, the Mongols set up a night camp. To prevent sudden attacks, the troops were positioned around the command tent, creating an inner circle of defense. The command yurt in the center, according to sources, was located about 400 to 600 meters away from the other yurts. Only the guards and approved personnel were allowed to enter it. Around this central yurt, the other parts of the Tumen were arranged, probably according to their decimal structure. According to our estimates, the area of the Tumen's circular camp was about 2 square kilometers. A camp with a diameter of about 1.6 kilometers could be crossed on foot in 20 minutes or at a gallop in 2.5 minutes. It should also be noted that the actual area of the camp increased significantly due to the pastures needed for the huge herds that grazed in the surrounding area. When it was time to move on, the order was given by drum beats. The first beat meant to prepare the horses, the second was for dismantling the yurts and forming up, and the third signaled the start of the march. The main formation consisted of a central column. It included the main body of the army, including the headquarters of the Tumen's commanders, as well as wagons with supplies. The flanks were protected by special detachments that moved parallel to the central column. They could also deploy to the sides to protect the army from possible ambushes. In front of the main column were the vanguards, and behind it was the rear guard. Even further ahead moved additional detachments of scouts and patrols. The strictness of this movement scheme for the Mongol army largely depended on the commander's decision, as well as on the terrain and the level of threat from the enemy. The main army, with all its elements, moved relatively slowly because the animals needed time to graze, and the supply units had to maintain the overall pace. On average, the army advanced no more than 25 kilometers a day, which was about the pace of infantry on foot. However, the speed and mobility of the Mongols were the result of their use of flying columns, small detachments of light cavalry that moved quickly without supply trains. Such columns could cover distances exceeding 100 kilometers a day, leaving the main army far behind and creating the impression of lightning-fast advances. These flying detachments were used for sudden raids, reconnaissance, and establishing advanced positions, which allowed the Mongol army to be renowned for its swiftness and ability to quickly reach enemy lines. Next, let's look at how the Mongol forces acted in battle. One of their most famous tactics was forming up in a crescent or pincer formation. The most experienced warriors were placed in the center of the formation, providing strength to the line. And on the flanks, there were mobile units of light cavalry, intended to outflank and encircle the enemy. The main goal was often to encircle and divide the enemy forces. This was similar to the tactics of steppe hunting, where riders would drive their prey by closing the circle. This was achieved by gradually exhausting the enemy through wave attacks. The Mongols often formed up in 5 lines. The first 3 consisted of light cavalry. The rear 2 were made up of medium and heavy cavalry. The battle began with the first line of horse archers moving forward and firing arrows at a range of about 300 meters. They used the long range of the Mongol composite bow. The arrows gained real power at a distance of about 50 to 70 meters from the enemy. And then the archers would turn around and return to the main line. Soon the next wave would move forward, creating an almost continuous stream of fire. After the third wave of mounted archers, the enemy was often in a state of shock, and this opened the way for a strike by the heavy cavalry, which crashed into the enemy while they were still disorganized. If the enemy maintained their formation, the Mongols could switch to a feigned retreat, a maneuver that had been perfected. They would sometimes retreat for several days to lure the enemy out and destroy them at the right moment. If the enemy didn't fall for this, the Mongols used another psychological tactic: encirclement with a small passage left for retreat. This escape route often prompted the enemy to flee. As soon as the mass retreat began, the Mongols would fall upon the enemy, using the chaos to destroy them with ease. Such tactics restrained, exhausted, and demoralized the opponents, reducing their chances of successful resistance to a minimum. The Mongols created one of the most effective armies in history based on strict decimal organization and unique mobility. They combined fast cavalry with the destructive power of the composite bow. Their military campaigns required detailed logistics, skillful resource management, and discipline, which ensured the army's autonomy and independence. As a result, the Mongol army not only conquered vast territories, but also set a new standard in the art of warfare. Well, that's all from me. Thank you for watching and see you in the next episode. Bye!